So again, this is from the Old Testament. This is hundreds of years before Christ. And the prophet has been talking about judgment. And then he comes around to talk about kind of post-judgment. And so that kind of picks up where we are today in the book of Joel, chapter 2, verses 28 to 32. And afterward, and this is like God's voice coming through Joel, and afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be God.
Your attention to the passage I read a few minutes ago. I'm not going to read it again, but I hope that you were focused enough to be able to kind of remember the gist of it. And in my mind, the most important thing, it came right at the beginning where he said, and after I will pour out my spirit on all people. And so that idea of him pouring out his spirit was something that the people began to look forward to. It included several different things and some signs and those kinds of things that went along with it. But the key aspect was that the Holy Spirit would be set in a special way. And of course, we are a Trinitarian church. We believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there are those who, and I don't want to get into theological trouble because there's overlapping and so on and so forth, but as a general rule, we often think in terms of the Father kind of being the predominant force in the Old Testament. As one of my professors put it, that was kind of God above. He was the transcendent, and then with the incarnation, the Son, who of course had been involved in the Old Testament, but became incarnate and became God with us instead of God above us. And so that introduced kind of a new era. And then the Holy Spirit, who of course had been involved all along, had been eternal just with the other two, but was going to come in a new kind of way, in a pervasive way, and things would change at that point. And that's what Joel is talking about. The Holy Spirit, not just making occasional appearances. There will be places like, David was filled with the Spirit, and then this happened, but it wasn't that pervasiveness that was coming. And Joel begins to prophesy about that. And so really, the wait is on. The people are now kind of longing for this, those who think about it, and they were hoping that Joel's words would be fulfilled and that these things would happen. And so they waited and waited, and of course, in hindsight, we know that as an individual person, that their waiting, it didn't pan out in their lifetime. And it didn't pan out for the next generation. But collectively, as the people of God, they continued to wait. And then the next generation continued to wait. And it went on for several hundred years. Jesus came, Jesus was crucified, Jesus resurrected, and then for the next 40 days, he made appearances to his followers and to his disciples, and several different times. And so then I want to turn your attention to at the end of the 40 days when he was about to leave the earth, and what last week I told you was Ascension Sunday, a few days after the Ascension. I want to read Acts chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Referring to those his appearances. Verse 4, on one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. And I want to skip down to verse 8, where it says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so the wait is on again. He has completed his earthly mission. He's telling his disciples goodbye. In the next few verses, he disappears into the skies. But he told them, it's time for the gospel to be spread. It's time for this new era. So wait. Don't leave Jerusalem. I want you to wait for the gift that the Father has promised. I want you to wait for the Holy Spirit to come on you. And when he comes, then you're going to receive power. And then you can leave Jerusalem. But then you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria. Kind of like if you were here, don't leave Kenosha. But then you'll be my witnesses in all of, Wisconsin, and then to the ends of the earth. So they're gonna spread out and leave Jerusalem after the Holy Spirit comes. So they're told to wait, and so the wait is on again. They've been waiting for the Holy Spirit since Joel prophesied it, and now with kind of a new. Instead of talking about the sun turning to darkness, which by the way happened at the crucifixion. That era is all included. The wait is on again. And so that brings us to what I really want to talk about today, which begins in Acts chapter 2. And I'm going to read verses 1 to 13, but I'm going to stop a little bit on the way and make some observations before I get to my main points. So, Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. When the day of Pentecost came, and so that's where I want to stop for the first time. The day of Pentecost was already a religious holiday. It's not one of those big, popular, famous ones to us. It was pretty famous to the Jews. But it represented 50 days from Passover. So Passover was this big, important festival. 50 days later, they had another festival, so kind of celebrating the first fruits of the harvest. They were supposed to make sacrifices of those first fruits of the harvest and all that. The word Pentagon, because it's a five-sided building, Penta has the meaning of five. And in the case of Pentecost, it's 5 tens, or 50. So it's the 50th day since Pentecost, which means it's the 50th day, or not since Pentecost, since the Passover. In our case, from the Christian perspective, it's been 50 days since the resurrection. We often, when we count backwards, if it's the 50th day, we don't count day one as day one. If I'm telling you something about yesterday, I will say, or 2 days ago, I'll say it's 2 days ago. That means Friday. But if you count Friday as day one, Saturday's day 2, Sunday's day 3. So on the third day, Friday was 2 days ago. So there gets to be some confusion with the days. But it's been 50 days, and that's where the word comes from, Pentecost. So when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Most scholars believe from the previous stories that one place was the upper room where they had been meeting to pray and conduct their business. They wanted to replace Judas. It was one of those business things they conducted. And Jesus had told them to stay and pray, and so that's where they were gathering for their prayer meetings. There's a few scholars who say no, because it was Pentecost on this particular day, that group had moved down to the temple courts and were kind of having a little meeting there because they were kind of involved in the feast, the Pentecost feast, as well as kind of praying together. So we don't really know. But they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house. Here we go. They were apparently still in the house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And so if you look around the room, that's why we have these decorations. That's why we have these hanging. They represent that day when the disciples were together and they're praying for the Holy Spirit to come so they can get about the mission that they've been assigned. They see what appeared to be like these tongues of flames, tongues of fire, coming down and resting on each of them. And so we're representing that in the room this morning for that reason. In fact, if you drive around town and look at some of the church signs that have like logos on them and that kind of thing, anytime you see flames on the side of a church building or on a church sign as part of your logo, so on and so forth, that's where those flames come from. It's representative of the Holy Spirit. And if you see a church that's called the Pentecostal Church, that's where they get their name. They put such an emphasis on this day that they made that their name. We're going to be the Pentecostal Church. And so that's where that word comes from. So that's what all of this symbolism means. Verse 5, now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd gathered together in bewilderment because each one heard the language being spoken. And they were utterly amazed. They asked, aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native tongue? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? Some, however, made fun of them and said, they have had too much wine. So the last thing that we see in that passage is that critics aren't new. There is something going on, and the Lord's followers are carrying this out, and they're doing this thing, and someone's going to stand up and say, look at them. They're crazy. They must have had too much to drink. They're drunk. And so, you've got those critics. Now, the church, honestly, has been through an era we are still not out of, a time of high criticism toward the church. There are churches all over the country who, in dealing with COVID, had people criticizing the church because they weren't going to have services during the COVID outbreak, and criticizing the church because they were asking people to wear masks if they're going to come. And then there were other people at the same time who were leaving the church and criticizing it because they were having services during COVID, and because they weren't wearing masks during COVID. And so you had both people criticizing the church, and they're mad, and they leave and go to that church, and they leave. And it was happening all over the country. So it's been a high time of criticism toward the church and how COVID was handled, and so on and so forth. But we can see from this passage that's not a new thing. The church has been criticized by some people since the very beginning. And speaking of having services, not having services, our sister congregation, Amigos in Cristo, has been not having services the last few weeks because of a COVID outbreak in their congregation. They will be back today. So they've kind of worked through it, and that's now behind them. So we're thankful for that. They will be back in the building this afternoon. But I want to go ahead and move on by reading the next 7 verses or so. Beginning with verse 14, let's pick it up there. Then Peter stood up with the 11. See, Judas has been replaced now. So there's 12 of them again. With the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. This is what he said. Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. I'm sorry. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he proceeds to quote that passage we read. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. And of course it continues on. Verse 21. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So I want to draw your attention especially to verse 16, where he says, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he quotes the passage. In King James, the grammar was a little different. Instead of saying, this is what was spoken, it says, this is that which was spoken by the prophet. And I loved it because somebody had kind of titled this story, if they were going to preach this sermon, this is that. Because in King James, that's how this phrase comes across. This is that. That prophecy that Joel made hundreds of years ago, that people have been longing for and hoping for, this is that. What's happening today is the fulfillment of that promise that Joel made all those years ago. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And so we have that fulfillment. So we had those people who have been waiting since Joel's time. And now, of course, we had Jesus' followers who have been waiting since the ascension. Since he told them, don't leave Jerusalem, wait for the Holy Spirit to come on you. They've been waiting. So we had both of those reasons to wait, those people waiting. And Pentecost was the fulfillment of both of them. This fulfills that promise made back in Joel that God would pour out his Spirit. And this fulfills the promise that Jesus had made, but wait until the Holy Spirit comes on you. And so both of those were fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, which is why it's such an important day for the Christian church. And so I want to just highlight briefly 5 things that are kind of in the aftermath of this, or why this is so important. The first one was, or highlight number 1, is that they received power. Jesus had told them, wait until you receive power. And so, how do we know that they actually received power? Well, I think the biggest piece of evidence, the biggest clue, comes from Peter. And I didn't read his entire sermon to you, but I just read you the first few verses. For example, he said in verse 22, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did among you through him, and you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. So there's Peter telling this crowd, God sent Jesus to you, and you killed him. There's Peter in a loud voice saying that to the people. Let's go back 51 or 52 days. They've arrested Jesus. They're about to crucify him, or they are crucifying him. Peter is hanging out at a campfire nearby, kind of watching from this fire. Someone comes up and they hear him speak and say, wait a minute, aren't you one of those guys that was following Jesus? And what did Peter say? Absolutely not. I don't know the man. And he did that 3 times in the course of, maybe an hour or two. 3 times people confronted him, asking him if he wasn't one of the followers of Christ, if he wasn't with this guy. And 3 times he swore an oath that he wasn't, that he didn't know Jesus, because he was afraid. 52 days later, the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit fills Peter. Next thing you know, Peter's up telling the crowd, listen, all of you Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me tell you this right now. God sent Jesus and you killed him. Now, how's that going to make the people respond to Peter? Hypothetically, or at least potentially. Peter's fear seemed to be gone. Or else, I love the definition of courageous. It's when you fear something and act anyway. So even if Peter still had some fear in him, he also had this God-given courage. He had that power to be able to speak, even though he was under the threat of what could happen. So that's part of what Pentecost gave us. I think it can give us all a boldness that we didn't know we had. All these people, I'd be embarrassed, I'd be afraid, I don't like to talk, and all that. But God gives us the ability to do that, to share the gospel. And I think that it's kind of a surprise thing, or maybe not surprise is the right word, but you don't feel like you're brave and bold until you do it. Until the need comes, when suddenly you're put in a place where someone's asked you a question or observes them, and now you have a chance. That's when God gives you the boldness, not ahead of time. And so I like when they receive power. That's one of the things that makes the day of Pentecost so important. Secondly, women were elevated. I want to remind you that as women are still working on equality, still not there yet. But 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, the Near East, it was really bad. I think I've shared with you before that Jewish men would pray that they weren't born, thank God they weren't born a woman, and so on and so forth, and the women had no authority and no power, and the men held all the power and all the authority. And in this short passage in Joel that Luke repeats in Peter's sermon, that Peter repeats twice, he says, this is going to happen to your sons and daughters. And a few minutes later, or a few seconds later, he says, and it's going to be on your servants, both men and women. And so, in this passage, on this day, women gain a new status. They join a new level. They become equal in God's eyes and in the church status. There's other places where Paul talks about they're no longer male and female, no Jews, Gentiles, we're all one kind of a thing. And so that really kicked in. Of course, in God's eyes, we've been seeing hints of that all along through the Gospels, in other places. But so that's one of the things that happened with Pentecost. It really elevated the status of women in the church and in church leadership. By the way, there's some scholars who believe that it was the woman Priscilla who very well have been the author of the book of Hebrews. And that would be one of the reasons why that the author is unknown, because it wouldn't have survived as well if everybody had universally known it was written by a woman. It took the church a while to learn its lessons. And they're still working on that, by the way. The church universal still hasn't accepted that equality of women. I'm thankful to be part of a church that does. Highlight number 3, the active instrument in what was taking place was the Holy Spirit. This language thing going on. The Galileans, like Peter, speaking their language, all of those different nations or cities, that I read the names of, are saying, but we're hearing it in our own language. That was a miracle that God was performing, and God was performing it as God the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was the active instrument in that miracle. It was the Holy Spirit that was giving to Peter the courage to get up and preach this sermon that he preached, where he got very confrontational with the people. And so that's why the Holy Spirit is so important to us in the church. He's the active agent in our lives today. And so we need to remember that. Highlight number 4, salvation was explicitly offered to everyone. There had been a time when the church, the Jews, they kind of understood that this is the way it works. If you're a Jew, and if you obey the law, and if you make the right sacrifices for when you don't follow the law exactly, that is how you are saved. And here we're told, Joel said it, Peter repeated in the sermon, Luke wrote it down. Verse 21, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So that's new. It's not all of you Jews who make the right sacrifices and live the right way, you'll be saved. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That is a big leap forward in Christian history. And so that was part of Pentecost. Before I get to my last highlight, I want to read one more passage. Acts chapter 2, only one verse, verse 41. Everything between what I've been reading and now is the rest of Peter's sermon, where he continues to lay it on the line to these people that day. Verse 41, those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. It is believed that group that was gathered together on Pentecost was about 120 people. That was pretty much the gist of Christ followers at Jerusalem at that time. That was the core group. And they went from 120 to 3,000 people, or 3,000 more that day. And so my 5th highlight is that this was the birth of the Christian church. That day, with Peter's sermon and the people responding, the Christian church was born. That's when it really took off. That's when it was planted. That's when things went kind of crazy in that regard. And so, that again is why this is thought to, that is why it is considered to be the birth of the church, and people can debate, shouldn't it be Easter? Shouldn't it, but this is really when the church was born. And so that's why we believe it's such an important day in the life of the church. And therefore, let's celebrate. Pentecost is where the church, and we're going to celebrate by having lunch together and having birthday cake birthday cake for the church, along with some cousin subs. And by the way, I hadn't really thought much about it, and I didn't really know that it was going to be cousins catered until I think yesterday before I knew that. But as I put this slide together, I thought, how awesome are the colors in the cousins logo? They just coordinate, which is, why we have the orange and yellow thing, and we encourage everyone to wear red today, and a lot of you